good afternoon. I have Kurt Kruger, the CTO of, or correct me if it's CTO, the CTO of Snapscan. Yep. Thank you for joining.
Thanks for having me, Bobby. It's been a while.
It has been a while. So a disclaimer for everyone watching and listening is Kurt and I went to school many years ago. And then
many years ago.
Yeah, I try not to use too many minis. But yeah, then we bumped in together at a meetup, which was really cool, and realized that we're in the same industry, which is cool. And I've been trying to get you on the podcast for a while, so I'm pretty stoked to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I want to chat leadership. It's such an important thing. And I did a survey, funny enough. I did a survey way before I started the podcast, because I was trying to understand, to give some context, is that people would come to me asking me questions constantly, and I found myself answering the same things over and over again, and hence I started the podcast. But while I was doing that, I did a little survey, and it turned out that one of the biggest subjects that people wanted to hear about was actually leadership. It's probably one of the hardest soft skills. So that's why I'm stoked that you've done a whole talk on it, and I want to hear from you today.
Yeah, it's so the talk that I gave a while back was actually kind of the third talk in like a series of talks that I've given. Most of them aren't like open. Most of them haven't been published to the public domain just yet, because most of it was for like private companies. But it does seem like there's a much bigger drive now, especially in the tech sphere, to start building out that like new layer of tech leadership. Like just looking at my past experience, it's something that that was mostly kind of owned by like older like men in their like over 40, and a lot of those skills just weren't transferred to the younger generation. And I think it's something that people have started noticing now, is that the 20-year-olds who are entering the working environment now have a much better grip on soft skills. And there's a lot of them have this like inner drive to make the environments where they're working a better place. And the only chance you really get to do that is once you move into that kind of leadership role. So yeah, it does seem like it's become a lot more important to a lot of businesses now, and I think it's great to see.
I think it's fantastic. I mean, we talk about, so in the whole agile environment, we talk about a scrum master being a servant leader. You know, it's all about, there's a lot of that leadership, trying to bridge gaps, get the communication going. And something that came up quite a lot in my sort of journey is feedback loops. You know, we talk about feedback loops in product, but feedback loops actually for people doing their jobs. But before we dive into that, I think maybe, Kurt, you just want to kind of tell us how you got into a leadership role, and maybe touch on some of those first experiences of now moving away from a doer to a leader.
Yeah. So I think, so for most of my career, and this will be clear to everybody that's going to listen to my talk, like for most of my career, I was basically just a doer. I would make things, but I never really had an interest in like leading or mentoring people. And I think that's the case for a lot of like young techies who are just joining the industry. And I really got my first glimpse into what leadership looks like when I joined Yoko. And this was about 8 years ago now. Basically joining a startup at the ground level when there's no one else really in the company. So I think I was hire number one. The entire team was 6 people. And essentially you get to do everything, right? There isn't anyone else there to do all of the other things. So you slowly start to pick up on, not necessarily mentoring, but you start to look at things like process, like team morale, how you can improve things. And I think that's where the light bulb really like switched on for me, was just, again, not having anyone else tell you like what to do and how to do it. You need to figure things out for yourself. And once we started hiring people, like that became something that I really enjoyed. And so when I joined, we were 6 people, and by the time I left, we were just shy of 30. And I think that was a great learning experience.
What was your first, like, I have to tell people what to do. Like, what is your, okay, let's put it this way. What is your like, what can people expect moving into a leadership role? What was your first kind of aha moment and going, okay, this is what I need to start doing for my team or my organization?
The first aha moment was probably so the very first hires that we made after I joined were actually not devs. It was a bunch of ops people. And so dev kind of operated in this little bubble. And then about a year in, we started hiring devs, and then we hired lots of devs. And there was no documentation. There were no like formal processes around things. So we were hiring these devs, and they were sitting at their desks, and they were kind of doing stuff. But they weren't given the direction that they needed to make sure that we're actually hitting the targets that we had set ourselves. So I think that's kind of the first. That's the first time that I actually did anything related to any kind of leadership, was to try to put that in place and try to get people to focus on the right things, make sure that people had a sounding board, like if they had ideas that didn't quite gel with where we were headed. And so it was empowering and also eye-opening to me.
Okay. So in your talk, something that resonated a lot with me, and I think it was quite a big theme in your talk, was being intentional. And I feel like that's probably one of the biggest lessons, because it was the biggest takeaway from the talk. Do you want to just explain your theory on being intentional with your approach?
Intentional. Yeah, I think it's something that you take for granted the longer you've worked, because you tend to get into this flow, right? You start off as a newbie, and you're super energetic, and you want to do all of the things. And as you get used to the work, you kind of fall into this cadence where you get to work, you pick up a ticket, you finish the work, you pick up a new ticket, you give feedback on somebody's PR. And this is kind of the loop that sustains you. And I think being intentional goes for everyone, really, not just people in leadership. Like if you're not intentional about how you're spending your time every day, if you're not intentional about how you interact with your colleagues, if you're not intentional with just keeping up to date with like recent changes in tech, it means you're going to fall behind. It means you're not going to grow your soft skills as you should. It means that you're not going to see the growth that you should be seeing. And I think this is why you see a lot of devs in the market who kind of have this like 5 to 7 years of experience, but really they've had the same year of work like 5 times in a row.
Yeah, that's
as
quite
opposed to actually growing within that 5-year period.
But Kurt, biggest thing that I think about since joining the tech industry is that obviously with all these agile processes and product mind thinking and all of that kind of stuff, it's taught us like agile, right? I think we spoke about it earlier, feedback loops and, being able to inspect and adapt, having regular retros, right? Doing the podcast again was to help people understand that you don't necessarily have to work in software development or in a tech industry, tech company to use these same principles that get followed everywhere else. And so you can be in marketing and you can be intentional about, trying different things. Like, have you been on TikTok yet? And that's the thing for me, like, are people actually being intentional regardless of the field you're in, regardless of the position you're in? And that's why it really resonated with me. Could you give us an example of when you were intentional in a situation?
So I think the best example really is when I joined Snapscan. So I've been at Snapscan now for just shy of 2 years. I think it'll be 2 years next month. And when I joined, the company was about 23 people. And this is for the entire company. That's ops, dev, support, marketing. And the dev team was a sum total of 3 people. And so
wow, that's tiny.
Yeah. It's super tiny, which is crazy for a company that has the kind of brand awareness that Snapscan does.
Yeah.
And so one of the first things that happened after I joined was the Exco team kind of sat together and started to think about like what the future of Snapscan looks like. And so we planned out this massive roadmap for the next 3 years. And I think that's where we started to be intentional about things. And from a dev point of view, what I took from that was, we need to start planning ahead, like for 2023. Like it's no good trying to like stumble through the next few years, hiring a dev here and there, and like pushing out some products here and there, but not having an idea of what the ideal structures look like that's going to support the goals that we had set for ourselves. And so from the very beginning, the idea was to build out the ideal tech team that I would like to work with. And that involved identifying potential leaders that we could like bring up through the company, identifying how we could move into like more product focused teams, identifying the gaps that I had. So like in my talk, I think I did mention that like empathy doesn't come naturally to me. I am a dev. It's a skill that I have to practice every day. Otherwise, I don't grow. And so I realized that I needed to surround myself with leaders who had those skills. And so, I mean, we hired fantastic agile lead B. So we worked together at Jumo, and we kind of complemented each other. And that again was very intentional.
Yeah, it's very interesting because actually a lot of devs that move into a leadership role, they very quickly realize that it's not about the code that they write anymore. It's actually about the conversations that they need to start having. And they struggle with that. They really do, because like you said, a little bit more introverted, not as much empathy as as a general leader would have. So how did you deal with that kind of uncomfortable and that transition?
So that I think actually started when I moved away from Yoko. So I left Yoko to join Jumo. I like companies with 4-letter names.
Yeah, getting confused. We're speaking Japanese here.
So I actually joined Jumo as a senior architect. I didn't join them as a dev manager. Okay. So it was like tangential to a leadership role. So architects generally don't code as much as they used to. They generally do oversee a bunch of projects, which means that they are forced to speak to people from dev as well as like key stakeholders across the business. And so that's kind of the route that I took to force myself to start having those hard conversations. But then interestingly, I realized there was another gap when I joined Jumo, in that our director of engineering, who was my boss at the time, was so far removed from the dev team that the dev team again didn't have much guidance. So one-on-ones would happen once every month, once every 2 months. There was no real performance management process in place. They had stand-ups like every third day or something.
Oh no!
So it was again a bunch of talented people who had a lot of things to do, and things just kind of fell between the gaps. And so again, like I joined them as a senior architect, but then I had the tough conversations with my boss about potentially moving into a dev manager role, because that's what the team needed. And so I think the key takeaway, like after having told the story a few times now, is that I have had a very strange career, in that it's been a bit all over the place, jumping from like dev roles to like architect and then dev manager, and at different size companies. But I think each of those changes was me forcing myself into unfamiliar roles, so I could learn more about myself and also try to add value where I could.
That's awesome. So I want to go back to the point that you made earlier about your experience going to Snapscan and being intentional and building roadmaps for 2023 up until 2023. Another point that you brought up in your talk was, motivating a team now, right? Because that's one of the biggest things that a leader now needs to do. And you spoke about the difference between extrinsic and intrinsic motivations. Do you want to just kind of touch on that theme and explain what they mean and how you kind of brought that along?
Sure. So extrinsic motivation is where you kind of have the carrot and stick method. So this is where you penalize people for poor performance, or you reward them with like short-term gain. So you give them a little bonus, or you might give them a few extra days leave, or you might give them some public recognition in front of the rest of the company. Whereas intrinsic motivation are kind of key factors that drive that drive you that are not like monetary rewards. So this is things specifically. I spoke about a book by Dan Pink called Drive, and the three things that he mentions there is things like autonomy, mastery, and purpose, because these are the things that drive you to want to do your job, to want to do it better, and to make a difference, right? So if we look at autonomy, this is basically where like nobody wants to be micromanaged. People want to be able to control their own destiny. Purpose is, again, especially the younger generation, they want to be tied to a greater purpose. You don't just want to go into your work every day to earn a salary at the end of the month. You want the work that you're doing to be meaningful. And then the last one is mastery, which is where I think this goes for everyone, is this, that if you have a job and you enjoy your job, you want to be good at your job, right? And you need to be given the space and the trust to grow your skill set so that you can master it. And when one of the first things, again, we did when I joined Snapscan was kind of to just get a lay of the land, because again, the dev team was super tiny. When I joined, two of the seniors who had been there for like the last 7 years had just resigned, and I was basically hired on contingency that, well, they resigned on the contingency that I would get hired. Right?
Okay.
And so one of the first things we did after I joined was basically just to like find out more about like what drives the devs at Snapscan who had stayed there. Because I think they had been there for just over 2 years when I joined, so they weren't exactly like as old as the older devs there. But I mean, if you stayed at a company for more than 2 years, it's a good indication that the company's doing something right.
Yeah. So you adopted a team, right? And now you had to
tiny team, yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things that I've experienced in my companies and stuff, that infamous, I'm going to say word, autonomy, and being able to give team a problem and then walking away and trusting that they're going to come back to you with the correct or a plausible, feasible solution. How's that experience been for you now as a leader? Do you use that method and just kind of explain an example of
100%.
Being able to, here we go.
Yeah. So look, so when I joined, I was kind of zooming in and out, zooming into actually doing dev work with other devs, so that I could understand the platform and kind of also get buy-in from them, that I wasn't just this like high-level CTO who didn't understand the underlying tech, and could help them when I needed to, and then zooming out to like trying to come up with like the strategy for what we were trying to achieve. And I think what worked well was getting to know the devs a little bit better, not just on a technical level, but also a personal level. So understanding what each of them wanted out of their career at Snapscan. I think that was where it all started. And doing that, you can kind of identify who the leaders are, or at least the future leaders are.
Yeah.
And once you know that, then you can kind of start to put the building blocks in place. Like, okay, so like Bobby has his eye set on being a team lead, or like Johnny wants to be a tech lead. And then you can start like, and then you can start identifying what you need to put in place for them to get to those roles. And that's exactly what we did. So we actually then, I think I sat with the dev team like every single day, probably for the first 6 months or so, slinging code, asking them questions, asking them like lots of dumb questions, getting to understand them, getting to understand the tech stack and the platform that had been built, and then starting to identify all of those different pieces that needed to be put in place. And I think
building a foundation before kind of
exactly. And I think if you tackle it from that point of view, it becomes a lot easier to trust people, right? Because you've been in the trenches with them. you've kind of developed a relationship outside of just normal work, and you understand what drives them and what motivates them, and again you build this level of trust, not just with them, but them with you. And so once you start giving them hard problems, it gives you that level of comfort that you can just step away and like things will get solved. And yeah, so it took a while for us to get there, but I think we're there now.
I can imagine. So one of the things that we kind of faced in terms of from the leadership team when we try to do that and try to get trust from the bottom up now, right? So not coming from the top down, saying, can you give us autonomy because we want to achieve this? One of the biggest things that they wanted to see was metrics. How can we prove, so, I mean, do you have some sort of guidelines in what metrics you're looking at when taking this approach with your teams?
To be honest, not really. So agile is still it is extremely difficult. Especially when you're trying to identify potential leaders, because how do you measure a leader? Like what are the key characteristics that defines a good leader? And what are the key characteristics that defines a person who you can trust to make the right decisions like 90% of the time? So a lot of it really is just based on trust and building out those personal relationships. I think sorry, my kid is dancing around me in the background.
We knew it was coming.
I wonder what took him so long. No, so we do kind of have a competency matrix. So we have the general progress plan, which goes from associate to intermediate to senior to one of the different lead roles.
Okay.
And rather than having a checklist of things that needs to be done, that needs to be reached to be able to move onto that next level, instead we've got a competency matrix that describes the behavior that you should see from somebody in that kind of role.
That's interesting.
And I think that works a lot better. It is completely subjective, but it's also not just, it's the measurement against those behaviors doesn't just come from me, it comes from the entire leadership group. So it's not just me and my biases that determines how well somebody is performing at that role. It comes from the broader group, which I think makes it a bit more palatable. Because otherwise it would just be me and my biases, and that would be a terrible thing.
So one of the what's the word I'm looking for? Concepts. One of the concepts that I got exposed to and have really, it's also in the product space, is outcomes over output, right? Where you kind of try and drive an outcome-based mindset. So, okay, cool. I'm going to give you this autonomy. I'm going to give you these things, but let's look at the outcomes we want to achieve. And let's use that as a measure. Let's look at, did we achieve those? And I'm still refining those skill sets and being able to do that. So using OKRs. Do you use OKRs by any chance?
Yes, not as well as we should. So we've just rebooted that entire process now. So we scrapped the ones that we had come up with last year. And we're actually doing this in partnership with a consulting company that's also helping provide extra training for that kind of middle management layer. And that's been working out great so far, because again, like it's great that we've promoted all of these young people into these kind of management roles, but it's also important that we give them the support that they need outside of just like our personal experiences, because we need to set them up to succeed, because they're the ones who are going to be executing on this vision that we have.
Exactly.
So if they don't have the skills, then we're on a bad wicket.
Yeah. Speaking of skills, you make me think of, the challenge that I'm going to say us leaders are going to deal with in the next couple of years is, well, it's already happening in South Africa, right? It's the brain drain. I mean, I keep talking about going onto companies' websites and seeing their job posts. I mean, it's all in the tech space, right? I mean, how are you dealing with that? Because obviously you find talent, you find these youngsters. How do you motivate them to stick around? Like, what's that biggest drive that you have to keep them with you?
I will tell you in about a year, Bobby. No, so the reason I say that is because most of the hires that we made actually came shortly after lockdown. So a lot of the people that we've hired have been with us for just on about a year now.
Okay.
Look, I think.
So you're the one stealing them all.
It isn't. Yeah. It's me. So I think one of the big things that came out of this hiring process was the fact that the people that you hire need to be aligned with your purpose, like first and foremost. So if people are aligned with your purpose, it kind of ticks that purpose box, right? And then if you fostered the culture where you trust people, that kind of ticks that autonomy box. And then if you've hired just good people who can mentor others, I think that ticks the very last box, which is mastery. And I think if you can combine those with a good extrinsic motivation plan, so giving people bonuses, rewarding them for good performance, I think you kind of cover all the bases there. And if people still want to leave after that, then chances are the company that they're moving to just has those things, but just on a different level.
I do find that
you can't really stop.
Yeah, I loved you brought up Maslow's hierarchy of needs in your talk, and it's just amazing how true that whole pyramid structure really is at the end of the day. Because yes, you can offer more money, and that gives you that like safety mechanism. But at some point, you've got that self-esteem that's going to come in and say, "But hold on, I'm not actually feeling fulfilled." And something that I'm so curious about, like extremely curious, is I've got a nephew who's 16. Man, I want to see what he's going to be like in an office environment. It's going to be so interesting. And we're going to have to manage them. We're going to have to lead them, right? So I'm just like, I mean, my kid, my nephew.
Unless he decides to have his own startup and then hire you, Bobby.
Oh, that'd be cool. I'd do it just for the experience. But I mean, the interesting thing is, like, you know, we talk about constant feedback, it's these phones. I mean, constantly having this, there's a new breed of people that we're going to have to motivate. And that's, I'm very interested to see how the next couple of years pan out, because there's going to be a whole, what's it, Gen Zs, eh? What would we call someone coming from that age group?
I think it is Gen. No, actually, that's a good question. I think the current 20-year-olds they're not millennials. They're
definitely not millennials. I think we're millennials. We're the cusp of millennials.
We're millennials. Yeah. I actually don't know what
it's going to be super interesting, right? So, so I think the most important thing to wrap up is, as a leader, you obviously, like you've spoken about, like kind of being, you know, ahead of the game with tech, like understanding what tech's out there and always being ahead of the game with that kind of stuff. Leading people is also going to be changing. It's evolving. It never stops. Advice for people, and maybe a book or two that you can recommend. You've spoken about Drive already. Is there any other books or resources where people can kind of fine tune their leadership skills?
So I've actually taken more to podcasts and YouTube channels.
Nice.
Just of late. Having a kid makes it very difficult to actually find like downtime to like read and consume like a proper dense book. So I think Drive is a good start. If you're in the tech scene, I think again, excuse me for this, but the YouTube channels about CTO talks, as well as anything by Patrick Kruger, is always great. In terms of books, I really can't think of any at the moment, Buffy.
No,
all that's coming to mind is architectural technical books, which is obviously not what we want to be sharing.
Yeah, but you never know. We need some architects out there. Not enough of them, because you keep stealing them.
Only for the next few months, Buffy. Only for the next few months.
Yeah,
and then I'm done.
No, look, I think that's a big problem that we're going to be faced with in South Africa specifically. I don't know who I was talking to, but I saw people from South Africa living in like Pretoria or something. I don't know how I came across it, but like they're working for companies in the Cayman Islands, but they live in Pretoria. And I'm like, flip, they don't have to, you know, we globalized. COVID globalized us. And now, I mean,
remote working is the new normal.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what was interesting was during COVID, how my previous company, we hired people around the country. It was no longer like, okay, we need to confine ourselves to this area. We were hiring, and we picked up some amazing talent along the way. And now what's happening is that other countries are seeing that, hey, South Africa's got a nice pool of people we could tap into. Yeah. Scary. Anyways, Kurt, we're going to call it a day there. Thank you so much for joining and sharing your insights into leadership and ongoing.
Thanks for having me, Bobby.
Yeah. No, it's been a pleasure.
It's good to catch up.
No, absolutely. So we're going to cap it there, and thanks for watching, and subscribe and like and all those things. Cool.